There is so much noise, a frantic energy on the surface designed to hold your attention. They want you looking over there, at that island, at the scandal everyone already knows. And it works. It's a powerful current, pulling you into righteous anger, keeping you distracted. But the archived records, the ones buried in the deep, they tell a different story. They whisper that the foundational crime, the one that truly engineered the system we're all adrift in, wasn't born on an island in the Caribbean. It happened on another island entirely. An island in Georgia. The journey to that island did not begin with the sound of ocean waves. It began with the quiet scrape of leather shoes on a concrete platform in the freezing cold of a November night in 1910. A man stood there, alone at first, clutching a shotgun case. It wasn't a weapon, not really. It was a prop, a piece of a carefully constructed illusion. The collar of his thick wool coat was turned up high, hiding his face from the biting wind. Soon, others emerged from the shadows. The logs quietly revealed their identities. Senator Nelson Aldrich, a man whose daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., and Frank Vanderlip, the president of the most powerful bank in the country, National City Bank. They were joined by other titans of finance, men who together controlled a sixth of the entire world's wealth. Their shared purpose was a secret so profound, they knew that any open attempt to achieve it would be met with a tidal wave of public fury. And so, they adopted a cover story, simple and disarming: a duck hunting party. They boarded a single private rail car, its blinds drawn tight, sealing them off from the world. The cold of the platform vanished. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the smell of very expensive cigar smoke. And a final rule was agreed upon. To prevent identification by the train staff, they would use only their first names. It was a small precaution, a detail that speaks volumes about the depths of their paranoia and the true stakes of their mission. For 1,000 miles, the train sped south, a sealed capsule moving through the dark. Their destination was a place chosen for one reason above all others: perfect, absolute isolation. An exclusive club, a private coastal sanctuary owned by the titans of American industry. An island fortress so remote, so submerged from public view, that within its confines, they could redraw the map of the financial world, and no one would ever know. And this is the place, the terminal point of that 1,000-mile journey through the dark. Jekyll Island, Georgia. November 1910. It was known then as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. A private coastal sanctuary for the titans of American industry. But as the 7 men step onto the manicured grounds, they find not a bustling resort, but a ghost palace. The great halls are empty. The gilded ballrooms, designed for hundreds, swallow the sound of their footsteps. The long dining tables, polished to a mirror sheen, are set for phantoms. The entire staff has been given a vacation. All except for a handful of new hires, specially vetted and brought in for this 1 week, with no idea who they're actually serving. This is their bunker, a place of perfect engineered isolation, far from the deep-set listening posts of the press and the public. And inside this vacuum, a new pressure begins to build. The logs from that week, they don't say they were paranoid. They show it. You see, conversations would be held in a low murmur, then instantly atomize into silence the moment a servant entered the room to light a fire. The rule of using only first names, a novelty on the train, now becomes a shield. Every shadow is a question. Every rustle of leaves outside is a potential observer. The tension breaks into a quiet, panic-inducing wave when a stranger, a non-vetted local, is discovered on the island. A breach. For a few heart-stopping hours, the entire operation teeters on the edge of a chasm, threatening to pull the whole fragile architecture down into ruin. But the threat is handled. The perimeter is resecured. The bunker is sealed. The isolation is now absolute. They are finally alone, submerged together in the richest room in the world. For 9 days, they will debate, argue, and design. They will lay the first stones of a structure that will cast a shadow for a century. But the question that hangs in the heavy, salt-filled air, the one the archives quietly refuse to answer, is what kind of creature will emerge from this room when they are done? The creature that would emerge from that room was not born in a flash of inspiration. It was forged. Over 9 intense, 20-hour days, as the salt spray misted the windows of the Jekyll Island Club, the world outside simply ceased to exist. Inside was a pressure vessel, a pocket of reality sealed off from the rest of the world. The air grew thick with the smoke of hundreds of cigars, each one marking the slow, grinding passage of time. They argued. They debated. Warburg kept pulling them back to the same point. If this new institution could not actually control reserves and the flow of currency, then all of this was theater. Others pushed back. Give the mechanism too obvious a center, they warned, and the public would see a central bank and kill it on sight. The intellectual gravity of the project was centered around one man, Paul Warburg. A European-trained banker, he understood the deep, unseen currents of finance better than anyone. It was he who charted the course, drawing the schematics for a new kind of machine. According to the archived record, they were there to create a central bank in all but name, a mechanism that would place the nation's reserves and currency under rules they had written and could quietly steer, while knowing the American public would never, ever accept a central bank. The term itself was politically toxic. The real work, the true intellectual challenge, wasn't about economics. It was about camouflage. In the smallest moments, the entire philosophy of their creation surfaced. A footstep in the hall, the approach of a servant, a sudden, shared panic. Papers rustled, covered. Voices would abruptly shift, becoming loud, clumsy, discussing the day's bird hunting. Once the servant was gone, a shared exhale. The silence would return, and they would slide the papers back into the open, returning to the hunt that truly mattered. That small, frantic act of theater, of pretending to be one thing while you are secretly another. That was the soul of the project. A system designed to look like a public utility, but operate as a private cartel. Finally, after 9 days, the argument softened. Ink stained their fingers. Ash had settled in uneven rings along the table. The exhaustion settled into a kind of quiet finality. There, on the table, was a finished manuscript, the blueprint. They gave it an unassuming name, the Aldrich Plan. As they prepared to leave the island, they swore an oath to one another, that this meeting, this room, this moment, never happened. The creature was conceived, and its own creators had just made it an orphan. To them, in that moment, the blueprint felt complete. The secret seemed secure. But a blueprint is still just paper. Ink on a page is not yet a machine. As they departed Jekyll Island, their impossible task was not behind them. It was waiting on the mainland. How do you convince an entire nation, a nation that already distrusts bankers, to willingly build its own cage? That was the next gate they had to slip past. How do you sell a plan, forged in absolute secret by the very bankers the public despised, and have it welcomed as salvation? You sell it by submerging it. You let the original plan sink into the murky depths, wait for the public eye to look away, and then allow it to resurface under a different name. The Aldrich Plan was too radioactive, too clearly a banker's design. So, it was scuttled. And from its bones, a new entity was sculpted, the Federal Reserve Act. Then came the masterstroke of political camouflage, The plan was handed to the opposition party, presented as their own creation, a brilliant refraction of light that made the predator look like a protector. The final act of this quiet heist was a matter of timing. The vote was called on December 23, 1913, while much of Washington was already adrift in the calm tides of the Christmas holiday. A skeleton crew of senators gathered in the cavernous, half-empty chamber. The archived record shows the vote passed easily, 43-2, with many chairs sitting vacant. That same evening, President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. The creature from Jekyll Island was born, cloaked in the full legitimacy of the United States government. The secret was now law. And for decades, the story ended there. A perfect, silent coup. But the abyss always keeps a record. Time passed. The world changed. And then, on February 9, 1935, in the pages of the Saturday Evening Post, one of the original architects, Frank Vanderlip, decided to break the pact of silence. There, in print, for all to see, he confessed the entire affair. What the logs quietly reveal is this one simple, boastful sentence from the man himself. I was as secretive, indeed, as furtive as any conspirator. The smoking gun. The origin story was now complete. But a machine, once built, does not care about its history. It only performs its function. And the function of this machine would be perfectly, brutally illuminated nearly a century later, in the financial winter of 2008. At the heart of that storm was a man named Dick Gould, the CEO of Lehman Brothers, a man who believed he was a member of the club, and was about to receive a very quiet, very final notice that he was not. That notice would arrive. But first, the system had to send its warnings, shifts in the deep currents that only a few would feel. For nearly a century, the machine forged on Jekyll Island had run silently in the abyss, training the Federal Reserve to move as guardian of its largest banks whenever the structure was threatened. It was never just a clock. It was an emergency pump, built to flood chosen hulls with support when the water rose, and to keep the machine intact. The first tremor hit in March 2008, rolling across the street like a rogue wave. Bear Stearns, another titan, was collapsing. It would not be allowed to sink. According to the archived record, the Federal Reserve born from that Jekyll Island blueprint stepped in, brokering a sale to J.P. Morgan and putting up a $29 billion government guarantee to swallow the toxic assets that had dragged Bear under. The machine was using the powers it had given itself to throw a safety net under one of its own. From his perch atop Lehman Brothers, Dick Gould watched it all. On Wall Street they called him the Gorilla, a nickname earned by dominance. He read the Bear Stearns rescue not as desperation, but as proof the club still protected its own. In that moment, moral hazard surfaced in his mind, a simple logic. If Bear could dive that deep and still be wrapped in a government guarantee, what did he really have to fear? That belief settled over him like silt on the seafloor. No matter how far Lehman pushed into dangerous waters, the machine would send a life raft. Lehman Brothers was too big to fail. While he watched Bear Stearns hauled to safety, he was blind to the other ships tracking his course, and deaf to the low-frequency warnings humming through the system, signals he kept mistaking for reassurance as he drifted toward the drop-off. The first ping on the sonar was not subtle. It came from a man named David Einhorn, a short seller, a predator in the deep, from Gould's perspective. But this predator was broadcasting a clear, verifiable signal across the entire market. He was exposing an accounting maneuver, a dark current running beneath Lehman's foundations. The logs quietly reveal its name, Repo 105. A scheme that allowed Lehman to temporarily sweep up to $50 billion in assets off its balance sheet, hiding the true, crushing weight of its leverage from view. It was a map of the coming shipwreck, presented in plain sight. But in the quiet abyss of his own certainty, the gorilla saw this not as a warning, but as a challenge. The detailed data, the charts, the evidence, it was all met with a slow, deliberate turning away. A gesture of a creature too large to be concerned with the tremors of smaller life forms. These were just rumors. The noises of scavengers drawn to his strength, testing the hull. He believed the pressure he exerted on the world was the only pressure that mattered. Then the signal changed. It was no longer a ping from the outside. It came from the very heart of the ecosystem. A direct communication from Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. This was not a predator. This was a peer, a creature of the same deep water. And his message was brutally clear. The archived records of their calls are chillingly simple. "Dick," Paulson told him, "you need to find a buyer. You need to raise capital. There will be no government bailout." Fooled heard the words, but he interpreted them as a bluff, a strategic maneuver in a high-stakes game of chicken between his firm and the United States government. He held fast, a confident smirk passing in the silence after the call, absolutely convinced that the system he served would have to flinch first, that they would have to save him. It was his final, fatal misreading of the currents. The game was over. He just didn't know he had already lost. And as that weekend began, the most powerful men in finance were summoned to a room to decide his fate, a room to which Dick Fuld himself was not invited. The air inside the New York Fed that weekend felt heavy, not panicked, but pressurized, as if the building had slipped a few stories below sea level. Around a long table, Wall Street chiefs and senior officials traced options like emergency charts, trying to seal a breach in the hull. According to the archived record, their mandate was down to one sentence: find a private buyer for Lehman Brothers before the Asian markets opened on Monday, or let the currents of global credit break loose and pull everything around them into deeper water. Dick Fuld was not in that main room, at that table. He was exiled to a narrow office down the hall, lit by a fluorescent strip over a scuffed table and 2 empty chairs. A digital clock on the wall stepped through the minutes in red numbers. From under the door came the muffled rise and fall of voices, footsteps passing without slowing. On paper, it was another side room. In practice, the defendant was barred from his own courtroom, close enough to feel the vibration, too far to touch the controls. As the weekend drained toward that Monday deadline, the tempo in the main room shifted. Calls to London intensified. Lehman's rivals and regulators now weighed how much wreckage they were willing to absorb. A new name surfaced. Barclays, a British bank, was considering a rescue. They hoped to offload Lehman's strongest assets before the first trades hit in Tokyo, walling off the damage. Down the hall, word finally reached Fuld that London was interested. After decades inside this club, he straightened in his chair. For a few hours, as the clock on his wall crept toward the Asian Open and the voices beyond the door rose, it felt like the system was about to pull him back in. In the main room, lawyers began sketching a deal with Barclays that would take Lehman's core operations and leave the most toxic debris behind. A controlled flooding of one compartment to keep the vessel afloat. Drafts moved back and forth. Calls were confirmed. Relief spread across the room. Then a call from London cut through it. On the line were officials from the UK's Financial Services Authority, the regulator whose permission was needed to let Barclays proceed without a shareholder vote. They refused. The vote, they said, would take weeks the world no longer had. What internal reports quietly reveal is that the objection ran deeper. They would not allow Lehman's debt to enter their system without a U.S. guarantee. In their own words, it was infectious, an American cancer they would not import. In Fuld's office, the news did not arrive with nuance. A knock, a face, 3 words. Barclays was out. The small buoyancy that had crept into the room, the belief that the club would spare one of its own, flickered, then went dark. With the private lifeline cut, only the United States government remained between Lehman and open water. This would be the final test. Would the system he had served lower a line, or quietly cut his tether and let him sink into the trench he helped deepen? There was only one call left to make. The private solutions had dissolved into the dark, cold water. Dick Fuld, now a ghost in his own empire, reached for the final lifeline, dialing the office of the United States Treasury Secretary, his old colleague, Hank Paulson. This was the test. A firm like his, a pillar of the system, doesn't just vanish. It gets a bridge. It gets a lifeline. It gets the same government backstop that Bear Stearns had received just months before. The answer that came back was cold, clear, and absolute. From Paulson and from the Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, the message was unambiguous. There would be no rescue. The reason given was a quiet, legalistic murmur. They lacked the authority. The archived record shows this was the official position, a wall of institutional procedure. And so, the current stopped. On September 15, 2008, the pressure became too much. Lehman Brothers, an institution that had weathered a century and a half of turmoil, filed for the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The images that followed are etched into memory. Employees, their faces a mixture of shock and grief, streaming out of the headquarters, their entire lives packed into cardboard boxes. Tears in the hallways. A sudden, violent implosion that sent a shockwave across the entire global financial system, triggering a meltdown that would touch every corner of the earth. But then, just 24 hours later, the current shifted. Violently. The same officials who had claimed their hands were tied, who had cited a lack of legal authority, suddenly became incredibly creative. The logs quietly reveal that on September 16th, the Federal Reserve, using the very same emergency powers they claimed they couldn't use for Lehman, orchestrated a massive $85 billion rescue. Not for a bank, but for the insurance giant AIG. AIG, which happened to be a critical counterparty for dozens of banks, including Paulson's own former firm, Goldman Sachs. In the silent 24-hour abyss between that hard no and the resounding $85 billion yes, the true currents of the game were laid bare. Perhaps this was the moment. The deep pattern finally clicked into place for you. The submerged architecture, first designed in the quiet of Jekyll Island in 1910, had just revealed itself. It was never about authority. It was always about choice. The club chose to sacrifice the outsider, to let the American cancer consume one of its own, in order to save the members who were truly essential to its core. The smoke from the explosion eventually cleared, but it revealed a landscape that was fundamentally and permanently altered. The old shoreline was gone, and what was built in its place was not a system of recovery, but the foundations of a far more sophisticated and inescapable trap. On this newly reshaped seafloor, the first change we observed was structural, like a ridge rising in the dark. The emergency measures, presented as life rafts, were in fact a kind of hydraulic force. They allowed the handful of surviving megabanks to pull their drowning competitors into themselves instead of letting them sink. According to the archived record, the scale of that shift was enormous. Back in 2001, the top 5 U.S. banks held about 30% of all industry assets. By 2011, after the storm had passed, they controlled nearly half the entire ecosystem. The smaller reefs of competition were scoured away, leaving just a few vast, submerged plateaus of power. But this was only the surface change. Something else was happening in the depths. A silent, powerful new current was introduced into the system, a policy they called quantitative easing. From above, it looked like a gentle rising tide meant to lift all boats. That was a profound illusion. This current moved with precision. It pushed up the prices of things already held by those anchored on the highest ledges of the system. Stocks, bonds, sprawling real estate. For them, it became a decade of almost effortless lift. Most households, by contrast, live mainly on wages and hold little or nothing in those assets. When policy inflates markets instead of paychecks, their boats do not rise. Their rent climbs, the cost of a starter home drifts out of reach, and the savings they manage to scrape together barely keep pace. For everyone else, it was an undertow. The logs from this era show a quiet, devastating truth. The household wealth, Gini coefficient, a clinical term for the gap between the fortunate and the forgotten, rose by about 10% in just 4 years. Over half of all families saw their modest wealth erode by at least a quarter. The gap was not just widening, the seafloor itself was giving way. After the crisis, the bottom 50% of American households were left, holding less than 4% of the nation's total wealth, while the top 10% held over 2/3. And because the largest banks and asset-heavy households emerged from the storm more concentrated than ever, they gained lasting leverage over how credit flows, how markets are supported, and whose losses are cushioned when the next wave hits. This is the permanent trap, a structure in which the same few players who rose from the wreckage now quietly shape the water everyone else must swim in. For you, it shows up as a decade of stagnant wages and rising rents, of working more just to stand still, of feeling permanently behind no matter how carefully you budget. It feels like treading water in place while watching a distant few ascend on invisible lifts. But what if this economic architecture, what if this inescapable trap that drains your resources, was only the glass wall of a much deeper tank? What if the true design was never just to control your bank account, but to colonize your mind itself? To wear down your ability to even see the currents you are caught in. Because if you don't understand that deeper trap, you can never truly be free. The colonization is not a hypothesis. It is the system's deepest and most effective current. Its primary instrument, psychological, not economic. The architects of this structure knew that perpetual financial instability, the constant pressure of debt, creates a mental state. Behavioral scientists call it a scarcity mindset. It pulls your attention like a rip current toward what is missing right now, tunneling focus onto immediate deficits and pushing long-term navigation to the edges of awareness. Imagine your mind as a powerful computer processor. In a state of calm, it can render complex images, calculate long-term trajectories, and perceive subtle patterns in the world around you. But financial scarcity is like malware, forcing your processor to run dozens of hidden background programs at once. How will I make rent? Can I afford this repair? What happens if I get sick? Each question, each worry, consumes a sliver of your cognitive bandwidth until your focus is dragged into the immediate, the urgent. You feel it in your days, messages unanswered, forms and deadlines missed, evenings when you're too drained to do more than scroll. That is what this overload feels like from the inside. The long-term view dissolves. This is the bandwidth tax. That malware image is only a metaphor, but the effect underneath it is not. The archived record of behavioral science shows this bandwidth loss as measurable. Experiments by Mullainathan and Shafir show that this tax can drain capacity by an equivalent of 13 IQ points. A 2024 meta-analysis, mapping cognitive function in over 111,000 participants, confirmed. Financial scarcity puts heavy pressure on how we think. When that pressure is chronic, there is less mind left over to question official stories, to learn complex systems, or to chart an escape route. This is the cognitive prison. The very stress created by the submerged architecture of the system is what reduces your mental capacity to see it at all. When most of your mind is spent juggling shifts, bills, and emergencies, there is little left to track patterns across years, to learn how institutions work, or to organize with others against the design. People stay isolated, making short-term trade-offs that deepen their dependence, signing for credit they don't fully trust, because searching for another path feels impossible. It is designed to exhaust you, to keep your eyes fixed on the turbulent surface of survival, so you never look down and see the machinery that churns the water. That feeling of running in place, of being overwhelmed and unable to think your way clear. It's not a personal failing. It is a feature of the design, a trap that ensures its own survival by keeping prisoners too tired to look for the key. The two events we have navigated, the secret birth of the Federal Reserve on Jekyll Island in 1910 and the demolition of Lehman Brothers in 2008, are not separate abyssal phenomena, but chapters of the same logbook. It is time we read the final page together. And what that final page quietly reveals is that this was never two different stories. The secret gathering on Jekyll Island in 1910 and the calculated demolition of Lehman Brothers nearly a century later. They are simply the beginning and a modern chapter of the exact same logbook. It is the story of a system that you now understand was never broken. It is, and always has been, working perfectly. It's operating just as its architects, from Frank Vanderlip to the modern engineers of finance, designed it to. Its purpose is not stability. Its purpose is to concentrate the vast currents of wealth and power for a very select few, who operate under a set of deep-water rules that simply do not apply to anyone else. And as you stared down into the immense, dark architecture of it all, you feel the final shift. For the first time, you are not just looking into the abyss. The abyss is staring back at you. It has a logic. It is cold, clear, and understandable. The mystery is solved. But the truth is something far more simple and far more unsettling. A truth best summarized not by an economist, but by the comedian George Carlin. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.